Welcome into the shallow end. I'm your host, Dave Schwartz, Iowa Dave on Instagram, and today's guest is someone with whom I share something in common. We both love baseball cards from the 1980s. His name is Dan, better known as 1980s Cards with Dan on IG. And in the short while that he's been back in the hobby, collecting 80s cards, through those cards, he's been able to get back in touch with a part of his past. You know, over the past few episodes on this show, we've talked about some pretty heavy topics, like whether to sell off our whole collections and start over, how cards tie us to past loved ones, and the impact of the wrong kind of hobby content. Today is, let's call it a palate cleanser, as we travel back to the 1980s, the decade of excess, the decade that looked back at its predecessor, the 1970s, with its Watergate and Vietnam and soaring inflation, and declared, lighten up, let's have some fun. Without further ado, here's Dan. Very happy to welcome in today's guest, Dan, 1980s Cards with Dan on Instagram. And some of my last few episodes have been a little bit heavy. It's been about thinking back toward fathers and mothers and families and whether to sell everything and start over. But today is one just for the collecting side of me. And I'm a huge fan of 1980s baseball. And Dan, I think you are as well. So Dan, welcome in.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to be here.
Good. Dan, why don't you give the listeners a little bit of background about you as a collector and your place in the hobby and 1980s baseball?
So my biggest era of collecting was really during the junk wax era. So it would have been from about maybe 84 to early 90s. And then like anybody else, grew up, went to college, kind of got away from it. And about the beginning of last year, I was told that I needed a hobby. And I happened to find a lot of junk wax cards, 80s cards at a flea market. And instead of looking through them, I kind of did one of those, hey, what do you want for it all? I gave the guy $100 and came back with all kinds of boxes and found that I was really, really interested in it again. And something I hadn't thought about, but it kind of woke everything up. Like, oh, wow, how much did I really love this back then? And I went back to the flea market the next week, found a binder. On the top of the binder was two Cal Ripken rookies, Wade Boggs rookie, Tony Gwynn rookie. You know, again, what do you want for it? Hey, I want $100. Well, how about 50? Okay, good. And came home, started 1980s Cards with Dan on Instagram. One day my wife was like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm setting up an Instagram page. Why not? She was like, oh, that's cool. And a couple weeks later, she's like, you know, you have like 700 followers. Yeah, it's amazing to me, but people love this. So it's really just it's a labor of love for me, and I really enjoy just sharing the passion of the cards. I find that the more emotion that's tied to a card, the better, the better the response is, and the more interested everybody is. And that's just kind of going back to my wheelhouse and just a what seems like better days for me. Just using that as a way to enjoy things.
Was there ever a temptation when you first got back in to go for some of the newer shiny stuff? I know you probably got a little, but was there ever a thought that you might focus more on the newer stuff or vintage, anything but the 80s?
I had a friend that got me into some newer football stuff, and I did get into a little newer baseball, but I really, as soon as I get into that, I kind of get back out. If I'm going to go out of the 80s, I'd rather go more vintage. I'd rather go more 70s or 60s or even 50s. I buy some newer stuff, but it's really of just players that I really admire, or some of the remakes. Like I love the 35th anniversary that Topps does. To get a Will Clark 83 or 84 when there was none, or 85. To me, I really like that.
So there's some people in the hobby they only want the playing day cards. They only want, say the Will Clark 86 through whatever he played, 2001, whenever that was. Sure. It sounds like you don't have that hang up. I'm that way with some vintage, where I love some of the reprinting of the vintage, but in sort of a glossy, chrome refractor type of thing, like a 53 Satchel Paige, right? But
Right.
coming out much later. You sound like you're okay with it though.
It depends on the card. If it's a nice looking card and if it's executed well, then that's great. If it's something that just looks like it was put out to put something out, I'm probably not interested in it. I'm very particular to a card. I mean, I could look at a card in my era and love it. I could look at a card in my out of my era and not love it, or vice versa. So it's I have to look at something and I have to resonate with it to really want to add it to the collection.
So at the end of this episode, we're going to go through our top 5 1980s cards. So I don't want to jump on that now. Are there any certain brands, any certain sets, any certain years that you hold in esteem?
I really loved 84 tops, 84 Donruss, 87 tops. I had a lot of exposure to. I had a lot of 87 tops growing up, and 89 tops was big too. I got really into those sets, and those are the sets that if I'm thinking, I'm remembering those most of all.
Do you still have them? Whatever happened to the cards you had when you were a kid?
I never had sets really. I might have had one or two sets, and they would have been later. They probably would have been like 89 score or 89 tops. I still probably have those someplace. The singles I have some of. A lot of the bulk got tossed along the way. Stuff like 90 Donruss that maybe wasn't kept right. But the really good cards I just pulled out a 65 Koufax that I bought when I was about 16 years old, and I had that graded a couple months ago. And so, it's been fun to dig that stuff out and rediscover it and experience it a different way.
Sounds like you and I, when we were younger, did it around the same era. So I started to trickle into it with the 83 set, 83 tops. And then 84, I just hit it hard. And from about 84 to I think 90, right? That's when I was really into it and just have such incredible memories of some of those cards or some of those sets. And when you just said now 87 tops, like about 3 years ago, I went back to my dad's place in St. Louis, and it's finally time to get for whatever reason, he never threw them out, which was great. And I must have had 10 to 15,000 cards of just 1987 tops with that wood border. I don't know what it is about that year that either it's you or others, 80s collectors, something about that year. They must have printed. I cannot imagine how many trees were killed that year for 87 tops. So that was just the year that seems to be the one that everyone just goes right back to as having had a lot or some memories that go with it.
Probably a whole forest for 87 tops. Probably a whole forest. Yeah, it was just such a great set. There's so many great players in it. The end of some eras and the beginning of eras, and there's just so much there. And that 87 wood border reminds you so much. I think it's the 62 top set, and it just looks so classy. I think people love it. It was the height of the junk wax era. It really was thought of as junk wax. They were great back then. So I think a lot of us have really fond memories of it.
Yeah, they're great cards. So you really got into it, right? So you got these from I think you said the flea market, right? You got that first bunch, and then you started this Instagram, and immediately with a great name, 1980s Cards with Dan. If I could redo my own Instagram name, I would now. But yours, if people are just going to search 1980s cards, boom, you're gonna pop up. But you also started a website. You moved into TikTok now as well. Just kind of talk about your way of sharing and expressing.
Well, sharing and expressing, the Insta's great for showing a card and for like a quick video or for a quick talk about a player. Today I put up something about Dave Stieb, just because he was such a workhorse back in the 80s. But so that's more of a short. Hey, look, here's a picture of a card. Here's a song that goes with it. Quick hit. The website's a little more long form. I do have a blog there where I kind of will pontificate on issues, if you will. So I do that once, twice, 3 times a month. I also have some cards there. I need to do some more work on the website. Actually, I'm a little bit behind on that. The blog's the one thing that I've kind of been keeping up with. TikTok, I just started playing around with. I been a TikTok consumer, not really a creator. So I'm trying to figure out what I want to do there. I even have a YouTube I haven't started yet, but it's just been, different ways of how do I express what I'm doing? How do I get my ideas out there and just have fun with it? I don't make any money off of it. I'm not selling anything. It's just, hey, here's a card I like and here's a song and let's talk about it.
What is the website? Why don't you share it?
It's www.1980scardswithdan.com.
What do you think it is about 1980s cards that resonates with so many people? And,
I
yet,
think some,
and yet, I'm sorry, yeah, and yet they have so little value sometimes. But what do you think it is about this decade?
there's so many guys guys of our age that are probably in their mid to late 40s, that this is what we grew up with. And to be able to get back into something, let's say our parents wanted to get back into collecting in the 80s. Well, they wanted to go buy Mickey Mantle or those cards. They were kind of expensive back then. But we could jump back in on the 80s and just buy a box or a ton of cards for $100. I bought a collection back, I think, in June that was mostly like 80s and 90s stuff. I paid $1,000 for this. Like I'm probably a third of the way through. I don't know if I'll ever get through the rest of it, but there's just so much availability. You can consume it. You can get it easy. You don't have to worry about the cost of entry that you do with some of the new stuff.
And what kind of things do you hear from people when you put up a post? Like you mentioned Dave Stieb, and
Mhm.
I mean Dave Stieb, not in the Hall of Fame, but yet he had to be one of the top 3 to 5 pitchers of that entire decade. There's a podcast that focuses on 1988 Topps cards, and they did a full episode
Right.
on Dave Stieb. The website, or I'm sorry, not the website, the podcast Rated Rabbi. He did a piece about focuses on the 1984 All Star Game. So of course Dave Stieb is involved in there. Even you just saying the name Dave Stieb a minute ago, my mind just goes back to people don't understand, right, how good he
Right.
was.
Right.
So when you hear from people, what kind of comments do they give you about your posts?
So many times, wow, that guy was a stud, or wow, I love that card, or wow, I missed that. There was a card that I saw I got from my buddy. It was an 84 Fleer Andy Van Slyke. And his comment to me was, "This card's worthless." And I'm like, "No, it's not." You know how many people won in 1984 Fleer Andy Van Slyke? That thing got all kinds of views and likes, and people were like, "That's a great card. He was a stud." That's all it is. It's just bringing back memories of these players that time kind of forgot, because they're not in the Hall of Fame, because they're not worth a ton of money. So just a lot of memories. A lot of us that grew up in that era. Maybe you collected cards. Maybe you watched baseball. Maybe, if you were in the Northeast, you got WPIX channel 11, and you got WWOR, which was channel 9. So you got the Mets, you got the Yankees. You got to grow up watching these games. You got to grow up watching these players, and a lot of that doesn't exist now. You can go back and watch this. You can watch Dave Stieb come a strike away from a no-hitter, two starts in a row. Who does that? Now pitchers don't make it through the 6th inning. So it's just amazing.
It's a really weird decade when you think about it for baseball, because the people who we think of who played in the 80s who are now in the Hall of Fame started in the 70s. So George Brett, Dave Winfield, Robin Yount, Paul Molitor, a bunch of others I'm sure I'm forgetting. I mean, I guess technically Reggie Jackson started in 69, 68, but he played into the 80s as well. And then the guys who started in the 80s who were fantastic either got hurt and didn't make the Hall, like Don Mattingly,
Right.
or they sabotaged themselves, Dwight Gooden and Darryl Strawberry, or they got into the steroid era, right? So Barry Bonds, Canseco, McGuire, Sosa, and that there's like nobody from there are very few people from the 80s who actually ended up in the Hall. Maybe Frank Thomas, Ken Griffey Jr., of course, with that 89 set. But it's a barren decade if your metric for greatness is just the Hall of Fame, because they either come from the 70s or from the 90s, and it just sort of skips over that one decade.
Right. If you measure it by that, absolutely. And it's, wow, this was a barren wasteland. But really, if you look at it in terms of players and characters and legends, it really was the intersection of a lot of greatness. Because you had the 81s, you have guys like McCovey, you have guys like Stargell, Banks, Yastrzemski, Carlton, Tom Seaver. You had those guys going out throughout the decade. And then you have some other guys coming in. And yes, you're right, they didn't hit the Hall of Fame. I think, quite frankly, Don Mattingly probably should be. But you get those guys. You get Mattingly. You get Will Clark. But you also get some guys that did make the Hall of Fame. You get Craig Biggio. You've got, the guys that did sabotage themselves. Again, Jose Canseco, Mark McGuire. Probably, Curt Schilling would be another guy that if he kind of wasn't being Kurt, he probably would be in the Hall of Fame for what he did. So, yeah, if you look at it just by the metric of the Hall of Fame, it's, wow, that wasn't great. But really, if you go back and think, I mean, Bo Jackson played in the end of the decade. I mean, there was nothing like that.
No, and there's another one, right? Bo Jackson, Don Mattingly, Eric Davis, all these guys who, when they started, you think these are generational people. Mattingly looked like the successor to the Yankee dynasty, and then his back goes out on him, right? Eric Davis just had all sorts of injuries, but he was putting up Willie Mays numbers for a couple of years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then I mean, but you're right. I guess I'm not giving credit to enough, right? You know, Fred McGriff started in the '80s. He's in the Hall now. Harold Baines, I guess we can have that argument another day about whether he should be in the Hall, but he's in the Hall. And I'm really glad that you brought up Biggio and Bagwell, Maddox. So I guess the pitchers would be sort of where it was. So do you have? I know you're known for the '80s, but are there some players who you specifically like, who you target?
Will Clark's a big one.
Yeah.
Don Mattingly, Steve Carlton was probably like my first PC. And there's some newer guys. I mean, obviously the old Hall of Famers I'll always grab. If I can find a Mantle I can afford, or Campanella or anybody like that. But, towards the newer, it's the Will Clarks, it's the Steve Carltons, it's the Don Mattinglys. I love like Roy Halladay. If you want to get much more modern, Roy Halladay, Cliff Lee, Chase Utley. Love right now. I'm really focused on Bryce Harper, Mike Trout in today's game. If I'm gonna go more modern.
And I would think that as you're a Phillies fan, I'm sure.
Right.
It sounds like Harper's been recruiting Trout for 3 or 4 years now to come over to the Phillies, and he's a Jersey guy. I
can only hope. I mean, I did my best. I put something on Twitter like, hey, you're putting a golf course in the area. Come on, come hang out at your golf course. But that wasn't answered, much like when I tried to apply by Twitter for the Phillies manager position, saying that I had won a number of titles on micro league baseball. People weren't impressed by that. I don't know why.
I need to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I loved micro league baseball. Before there was fantasy baseball, there were 6 or 8 of us who did annual micro league baseball years, and it's like that has been etch-a-sketched from the internet. It is hard to dig in and try to find micro league baseball. So to all you folks out there who are also into 1980s baseball, we hope that you understand what we're talking about when we say micro league baseball. It was almost like fantasy baseball meets, the whatever the video games are now, in which you are drafting players and then simulating the games. Dan, this just made my week. Thank you for bringing that up. There were times where I thought I was going crazy that didn't actually exist, but it was a real thing.
It did, and so many of us that are into the cards of the '80s, probably because of that. Because you could look at the cards, you could watch the games, you could go home and play micro league, and if you played micro league, and if you had the stadium disc and the season disc, you got used to looking at those players. You knew who was on the '85 Phillies, you knew who was on the '86 Phillies, and it wasn't just the Mike Schmitz or the top players. It was the fifth guy on the bench, the left-handed pinch hitter, the Greg Grosses of the world that you got to know, and I think that just really enhanced our appreciation for baseball in that era.
Right. It's how that if you were in that era, it's how that Bob Welch once won 27 games, right? And now he's sort of forgotten history, but he was, or that Rob Dibble, if you were to put him on your team, he was going to strike out 90% of the people that he faced or give up a homer. Those were sort of the options, right?
There was no in between.
There was no him and Brian Harvey, right, from the Angels. Yeah. So I'm going to get back to Will Clark a little bit. He had this really interesting, almost parallel career to Rafael Palmeiro, where they went to the same college. I think they went to Mississippi together.
Right.
They end up trading places back and forth with Texas and then Baltimore and back and forth. But he starts with the Giants. And they talk about Griffey's sweet swing, and I'm not going to diminish that. Griffey's swing was one of the greatest things in baseball history, right? But Will Clark came in about 2 to 3 years ahead of Griffey and was also a lefty. And he spent only 1 year crossing over with Bonds. Bonds leaves Pittsburgh, comes to the Giants, and he and Clark overlap for a year. The story is that Clark was not happy with how he was treated, may have been a little bit jealous. But for those who aren't as familiar with who Will Clark was, why don't you talk about why you like to have him in your collection?
I just loved Will Clark. The best way to put it is go back and find an episode of This Week in Baseball. Watch the end credits with the song and look at that swing. It was an amazing swing. He was the intersection and the merge of a great batting average and power. He was clutch. He wanted to win. I love guys that get fired up, that look like they want to win. And part of the reason why we were so tough on Mike Schmidt in Philly was because he just seemed like he didn't care. Dude was great. He really did, but he didn't look like it. Will Clark looked like he was giving you everything all the time. I just started to really become a fan of his, and it is a shame. I mean, I think it's a shame that he played in San Francisco because it cost him home runs, and it's a shame that he had to leave there because I think what he said was it came down to money, from what I've heard. Just hey, they paid Bonds, they paid this, they didn't have enough to pay him. So it would have been great if he could have been that generational talent there. If he could have been the guy. But yeah, he's somebody that I got into. Way back when he first started. Probably we'll touch on it during our favorite cards of the '80s too. But it's just he's a guy that I always liked, and the fact that he hits 340 for the Cardinals in 2000 helps them get to the playoffs, and then retires. And he had probably 3 or 4 years left, but his son Trey is autistic, and Will realizes that Trey does better when Will's home. So Will says, "You know what? I've had enough," and he walks away. And just to listen to him talk about it, it's amazing. And even when he had his number retired in San Francisco, sorry, he says, this is my Hall of Fame. Like that's what mattered to him. You got to love a guy like that.
Yeah, 100%. One could read into some of the stories about his personality, but it was always like you said, because he had high standards for himself and others, and he's not somebody who would hold his tongue. He certainly would go after the other team, right? And he had his share of scuffles, but he also would do that within his own clubhouse. But that was not so much based on personality, but so much as if they were not giving their all. His view is that it was his place to step up.
Right, 100%. He was the clubhouse police, which is the function of a leader, especially back then. A lot of what happened back in those days doesn't necessarily translate into this era. But, back then for the time, he was what they needed.
Yeah, 100%. I do wonder what would have been the Giants were pretty successful anyway. But if they had added him during his prime to the lineup that already had Bonds and Jeff Kent and others, who knows what they could have accomplished. Because he was also a good fielder. Been amazing. He was a good fielder too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I want to get into this idea of talking about 5 cards. So I asked each of us to talk about 5 cards that we have from the 1980s that resonate in some way. Curious to hear what you picked. And looking at mine, it just popped into my head that I have no Hall of Famers, which is really funny. That was not intentional. There's one person in there who probably should be, that could be argued that could be. So I thought, well, we just kind of go back and alternate back and forth. You're the guest, and so we're going to do this in a way that you're going to get to go first and get to go last, which means at some point I'll go 2 in a row. But why don't you start us off with which of the 5 cards from the 80s you decided to talk about today?
I'm probably going to steal one from you from hearing your podcast, but probably the top one is 84 Donruss Don Mattingly. It's the chase card of our generation, and just everybody wanted that card. Nobody could get it. I finally got it probably in the early 90s. I just had that card graded a couple months ago, and it graded terribly, graded a 4, but I love it. And I'd actually picked up another one at the end of last year at a show because somebody had it for like $20. Like, how can I not pick up this card? But yeah, 84 Donruss Don Mattingly. Not the most valuable card in the world. We're not buying cars on it, but man, the chase card of our generation.
100%. Yep, that was absolutely in my stack. I chased it for 35, 40 years. And look, it used to be in the Beckett magazine. It was unattainable. I could mow all the lawns I wanted, work in the grocery store. Right. I would have to sacrifice 2 paychecks just to grab what that thing costs back in the late 80s, early 1990s.
Yep.
So I finally picked one up. I did pick one up 4 or 5 months ago now. I picked it up in a 7. It is the most beautiful 7 one has ever seen of this card. Of course, it's the iconic 84 Donruss design, which is beautiful. I've got another 84 Donruss here coming up. You brought up the 84 Van Slyke earlier. that was a great set. Joe Carter was a rookie in that set as well.
Yeah.
But the Mattingly does not grade well. The 10s go for four figures, easy. I would have a hard time justifying paying four figures for a non-Hall of Famer. Plus, who cares anyway, right? It's just being able to own that card is really what matters. That is, in my opinion, one of the three iconic cards of the 80s. It was the first iconic card. Rickey Henderson played himself into having the second iconic card with his 80 tops. And then, of course, 89 Upper Deck Griffey, which came across later on. But those are the three cards from that era that I think stand out more than most.
Pretty much, yeah. I think the thing with that 84 Donruss was it's just such a beautiful card. And yeah, you're 7. You know, you love that 7 more than a PSA 10 and a lot of things. And I love my 4. I mean, I'm not giving that thing up. I just love that card.
Yeah, there are some people who say, I think it was Josh from Card Ladder made the point that anybody with a lot of money can go and just get a great set, right? But that doesn't necessarily make you a collector. I think you need to appreciate it on some level. All right, I'm going to jump into, that was my first, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump into my second now. It's another one from 84. If you're listening to this, you're not going to be able to see it, but I am going to hold it up for Dan. I don't know what the glare looks like, but it is an 84 Donruss Bill Madlock.
What a cool looking card.
Isn't that great?
That's a great looking card.
It's a color match. And so Bill Madlock, one of those forgotten people, he won 4 batting titles. He won back-to-back titles in the 70s, then he won something like an 81 and 84, something like that. He is wearing that bright yellow early 80s Pittsburgh uniform with the pants, and then that's almost like a square hat, which is, I'm not going to sugarcoat this one. It does not hold up well. It's fun to look at in the fact that it was unique to that period, but it's just kind of goofy, and I can see why players didn't like to wear it. But I like the card because the swoosh, sort of the swirly lines at the bottom, that wave at the bottom of 84 Donruss matches the yellow of his pants and his hat, and the undershirt he has tucked underneath his black Pittsburgh, I almost said Steelers, Pirates jersey as well. It is a great looking card. Plus, it's somebody who I remembered seeing as a kid, not understanding why he wasn't more revered, having won 4 batting titles. And then you look back and he was sort of all over the place. He barely got 2,000 hits for his career. He would hit 350 and 360 and 340, and then would go and bat 240 and 250 and 260. So I'm not going to argue that he deserves to be in the Hall, but as lots of people have said before me, there should be a Hall of very good, and he would certainly be a first ballot inductee into the Hall of very good. So Bill Madlock, congrats, you made the list.
I think that card is that's the measure of a real collector. Right? Is that you look at this card, you go, man, I really love Bill Madlock. This is a great looking card. I have to have it in my collection. And that's the difference between somebody like us or somebody that just buys for value, and I'm going to flip this, or that's worth a ton of money, or whatever you have to do. We're looking at these cards going, wow, that's a beautiful card. I have to have it. Guys like Madlock, Dave Parker. I mean, come on, they were amazing, and time kind of has forgotten them. So it's wonderful to see that card actually.
Yeah, I mean, and who watched baseball in the 80s, and if you were not a fan of the Pirates or a fan of the Reds when Dave Parker got traded or signed, I don't know how he left the team, but who was not scared every time Dave Parker came to bat against your team? You were just waiting for him to crush one, because he was giant. He was a big dude, 6'5", 6'6", the Cobra, great nickname. Had some problems in the 80s, like some 80s players did, and we won't go into that right now, but what a player. So what's next on your list?
Second, I'm going to go with just a personal card, and that's an 87 Donruss Will Clark that I actually sent to the San Francisco Giants and got back probably 9 or 10 months later, signed by Will Clark.
Wow.
Probably in like the beginning of 88. I've had the card since then. I'm sure it's not in great condition. I'm sure it wouldn't grade well. But just, as much as I love Will Clark, to have gotten something that early through the mail, and even when people said, oh, it's a rookie card, you shouldn't have gotten it signed, you devalued it. Like, I just love that card. So there's a lot more valuable cards, a lot more, but just the meaning of that card to me, I got it, I pulled it, I sent it off to be signed, I got it back. I remember I had forgotten about it. I thought it was never coming back. And sometime in like February, I get this envelope and it's postmarked from Mississippi. And I'm like, what is this? And it was my card. So I'll never forget that. I'll never get rid of that card. You could offer me a house and I'm not giving that card up.
And you said 87 Don Russ. So that's the one where it's a
Right.
sort of like a profile headshot of him appearing
Right.
happy. Actually, he seems to be smiling. He's made the team.
Right.
He's got that beautiful rim around that 1987 Don Russ had of the black with the sort of the baseballs designed around it. And that's a great story. You think, well, my card's gone, right? And
Yeah.
then it appears.
And I never would have thought it was coming back. I couldn't believe it. I was so psyched to get it back, and I'll never forget that. I could buy a lot of cards, I could send a lot of things off, but to get that back that first time was amazing.
How long ago was that you sent that card off?
Yeah, probably would have sent it out sometime in '87 after I pulled it from a
So you
pal.
were a kid. So you were a kid.
I was a kid. Yeah, I was doing
Yeah.
through the mail autographs as a kid. So, it would have been sometime in '87. And like I said, getting it back probably the beginning of '88, probably like right before spring training, I think.
Right. And since Will Clark lived in Mississippi, it kind of says a lot about him. They must have shipped him the cards. I'm sure there were probably some other autographs he had to sign. They
Right.
shipped it to him somehow, and then he still took the time to do it from
Yeah.
Mississippi, and then he sends it back to you, or an assistant sends it back to you with his signature, which is fantastic.
He still does. He still does through the mail.
Mm.
I know that you can send it to him. I think he might ask for a donation for Autism Speaks these days, which nobody's going to complain about a donation for a worthy charity. But yeah, you can still send things to him. He did a paid signing. I actually got a jersey signed by him a few months back too. But I think you could still send him things, and with a small donation, he'll sign it for you.
It's a great story. My next one doesn't have that kind of story to it, but my next one is the 1989 Topps Future Star Greg Jeffries. Greg Jeffries ended up playing for the Phillies down the line as well, but he came up with the Mets, and he was the chase card of '89 until the world realized who Ken Griffey Jr. was.
Right.
And I like this card because it reminds me that prospecting is hard, that prospecting can be silly, and that it rarely pays off. I mentioned before Eric Davis. His card it cost so much, around 85, 86, 87, because he hit 30 homers and stole 80 bases. There were 27 homers, 80 bases in the same year. So congratulations to what Ronald Acuna accomplished this year. Eric Davis basically did that 35, 40 years ago.
Right.
Right. But then his body fell apart. Eric Davis, I'm not joking. Eric Davis, once I saw this, he pulled a hamstring taking a pitch. He had become so fragile. I think he was with Detroit. He stood there and it was a curveball. He thought about swinging. He didn't swing. Hamstring pop. He didn't make it. Right. So when I look at this Greg Jeffries, he's leaning over. He's got his hands on his thighs. He's smiling. It says Future Stars. He does have some cards in '88. I think '88 score. But this is the card that if you pulled, you're like, this is it. I'm holding on to this card, and it's going to be worth who knows how much money someday. But I'm never going to get rid of this. I'm not going to trade it to my friends. No way. On top of that, he never really recognizes his potential in New York. But he comes to St. Louis, and I'm from St. Louis. I'm a Cardinals fan, and he becomes an all-star. And all of a sudden, the potential comes out. He's an all-star. He's hitting well over 300. He's extra base hits all over the place. It turns out that the hype was right. Becomes a free agent, goes to Philly, I think, and it sort of regresses, not quite to where he was with the Mets, but sort of to what he was pre-St. Louis. So I got that St. Louis connection with him. Plus, always the reminder of careful with prospecting because it's just playing darts.
He was amazing in St. Louis, and it just makes you wonder: was he just not a big market guy?
Yeah, it could be. Some people are just like that. So, what is next on your list?
Third, I would go with the '82 Fleer Pete and Repeat with Pete Rose and Pete Rose Jr. And just because, if you were in my area in like '85, nobody was trading that card. No, that was you could give up everything you have. Nobody's getting that card.
Is that the one? Is that the one when he's in the on deck circle?
I believe with his son, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that card was just so hard to come by. I never had it. I never had one until I bought that binder last year, and it had a couple of them in it. So it's just that card meant so much to us. And look, we all know the story of Pete Rose, and maybe he's selling his legacy, but just what it meant at that time, and everybody going to Little League and trying to get number 14 and fighting over it. There was nothing like that.
You said 83 Fleer, right?
82.
82 Fleer. Fleer had a lot of fun with those types of cards back then. They
They
also
did.
had the one with Steve Carlton next to Carlton Fisk, and the card
Right.
says Steve and Carlton, right? So
Yep.
they were trying to do something to get recognized, and I definitely applaud that.
Yeah, they didn't do great with their photo quality or their card quality, but they had some really cool ideas. I mean, Pete and Repeat, Stephen Carlton. There was a really cool big red machine card. There was a bunch of those, and they did that for a few years with the Superstar Specials. They were really good at that.
Yeah, speaking of Fleer and photos, they didn't really get it. They never really got it with photos until 87. And they had that
Right.
87 Fleer is my favorite Fleer set of all time. That sky blue rim around the card. But man, they just didn't get it. And I think that caught up to them ultimately with,
Yeah.
because Topps is Topps and they have the history. Don Russ had the rated rookie, and around 86, they seemed to really get 85. Don Russ is when Don Russ sort of took it to another level, but Fleer waited too long. And by
Right.
then they were baseball wise, they had they were known for their basketball, but for baseball, they just couldn't really keep up.
That 87 set is beautiful though. That border is that just says 80s. If you had to say 80s in the card, it'd probably be that 87 Flair. It's such a great set. And I don't know that time remembers it as fondly as we did, but it's a beautiful set.
Yeah, as we record this, there's an 87 Bo Jackson Fleer rookie tonight coming up on PWCC, and it might be the time I finally pull the trigger on it. That's a card that I don't care a lot about grades, but I don't want that one in a lower grade. I want it to be centered and bright and shiny, and
Right.
yeah. So my next one is my favorite childhood player growing up. It is the 1983 Topps Willie McGee.
Oh, that's a great one.
It's a great card. Willie McGee. There's this misperception that everyone in St. Louis worshipped Ozzie Smith, and he was certainly really popular, but he was more of like a national player. He was the Wizard of Oz, and he'd start each season by doing his back handspring flip, and of course he won all the Gold Gloves, and he's a deserving Hall of Famer. But Willie McGee, if you were a kid growing up in St. Louis, he was the one that everyone loved. They called him E.T. Because he just looked. First of all, he came up when E.T. was popular, but he was just really awkward looking. His batting stance,
I remember that.
He looked like he had no bones. He was all kind of wiggly. But the dude, man, he finished with almost 2,500 career hits. He won 2 batting titles, an MVP, 3 pennants, and a World Series. Again, I don't think anyone would argue that he's a Hall of Famer, but he's one of those people that was just a fantastic player. And then came back to St. Louis after retirement, and he's a batting coach during spring training. He does a lot of other things with the team. He's just the guy. And so I love having that card in my collection. I look back and I just smile because even the picture on that 83 card, 83 is every 20 years, 1963, 83, 03, and then 23. Topps does the set where they have the picture of the player in action, and then there's a smiling picture or a profile picture down below, smaller. And even that, he just looks awkward. And it's like all those school pictures that we all used to take where we all look terrible, right? And I think the Mariners had a guy named, his last name was Hansen, a pitcher named Eric Hansen, who was equally as awkward. And he's like, oh, not that guy. But Willie belonged to us, right? Willie was our guy. Multiple Gold Gloves, World Series champ, and he's just a legend in St. Louis.
There's a real crossover with him and Andy Van Slyke. You have Andy Van Slyke starting out in St. Louis and going to Pittsburgh, but Andy was that guy in Pittsburgh too. Everybody knows Bonds. Everybody knows everybody. But, Van Slyke was a good player for a long time. He was, Willie McGee and him were kind of on the same level for a long time.
They were in the same outfield. So when they went to the 85 World Series, right, it was Van Slyke was in right, and then you had Willie in center, and any ball that went, from the right field foul line toward left center where Willie could roam that way as well. It was an automatic out. And
but nobody remembers he was in St. Louis. Everybody remembers him in Pittsburgh.
Sure. Him, Bonilla, and Bonds. What an outfield.
Right? Yeah, but it's like, here's Van Slyke not only overshadowed by Bonds and Bonilla in Pittsburgh, but overshadowed by Smith and even Willie McGee in St. Louis.
Yep. So what is your fourth card?
Fourth, I'm going to go with the 1984 Fleer Pine Tar game card with George Brett and Gaylord Perry sitting on the bench with the bat. And I just will never forget how big that was. I like I said, I love guys with fire. So Brett storming out of the dugout like he wanted to murder the umpire because he called him out because Brett just wanted to win. I love that. And I remember again we got Channel 11 in the Northeast, so I remember coming home from school and turning on the end of that game. And how weird was the end of the game? I think Don Mattingly, wearing number 46, played second base.
That's
But
right.
I just there's so much memory behind that. So I just love that card for that reason.
Right, and the home run that was eventually called not a home run was off Goose Gossage, wasn't it?
Yep. Yeah, it was upper deck. I mean, it was no doubt about it. I mean, he just high fastball. He just cranked it.
And then sort of the crazy genius Billy Martin comes out,
Yep.
the manager, one of his 4 or 5 stints managing the Yankees. He comes out and he has the bat and he argues that there's too much pine tar, that it goes up too high or whatever it was on the bat. And the umpire says, "Yep, you're right," and calls Brett out. And Brett comes, find the YouTube clip of this. George Brett comes out of that dugout with more rage than I've ever seen from a baseball player toward an umpire. Yeah,
it was amazing. And just Billy Martin. If you grew up in '80s wrestling, Billy Martin was the closest thing to a wrestling heel you had as a manager. I mean, he really was. He was the Jimmy Hart of baseball. He really was.
And sometimes to his own players, right?
Absolutely. I think
he
punched Reggie Jackson, didn't
he? They did, and they would fight. And then I think when Billy died fairly young, I think Reggie cried. I mean, they had this amazing, sort of crazy relationship. All right. Well, my last card, I mentioned at the beginning that one of the players I think should be in the Hall of Fame. Don't want to make this a discussion about steroids or not. But my last card is the 1986 Fleer update of Barry Bonds. And yeah, and if listening at home, he's sort of standing from the side. It's a profile shot. It's almost like a throwback picture to how 1950s baseball cards would look. I could see someone like Aaron or Mantle posing like that for a photo. And the reason I like this one is because I've just never been all that impressed or moved by the 86 Topps traded card of his, or the update card of his, which is just sort of him half smiling, doesn't look thrilled to be there. We know what Barry's like, right? Was probably annoyed he had to sit there for the photo shoot. I even owned briefly a Tiffany version in a 7 of that Bonds card, and I got it in the mail, and I thought I wanted it. I thought, nope, it's just a boring card. But this one, I do appreciate Barry Bonds, the player. I covered him for a while when he was with the Giants, and he would come through Chicago, which is where I worked, and not to poo-poo what was PEDs, but I've never seen anything like that out of a baseball player. Anything what he produced, the distance he would hit the ball, the way that he would light up pitchers who we also knew were on steroids. It was like playing a different game. And I was sort of identified with him as well in that, there's that 98 season where Sosa and McGuire were getting all the hype. And Bonds knew, and everyone knew that something was going on there. And if you look at the 1988 All-Star game, these are guys with these giant muscles. And when you're on steroids, it puts fluid into your muscles, right? So that's why they look so big. They're overhydrated. And Bonds at that time during the All-Star game had not started yet. And he's still skinny Barry at that point. And you can see how the best player in baseball, which is what he was at that point, would have just sort of snapped. Because he had an ego. He wanted to be the best. And he saw people clearly cheating and getting an advantage. And then he had a very, not saying right, but he had a very human reaction to it.
Sure.
And so I wanted to have a rookie card of Barry's, and I did not want it to be that boring 86 card or that lame Don Russ the rookies 86 card with the weird green border around it. So I went with the 86 Fleer because it looked like it's before they had the bright colors of 87. It was still dull, and if someone had told me this card came out in 1958, I would have believed them. And so that's the Barry Bonds card that I picked.
It would have fit in perfectly there. And that 86 tops traded set was amazing, but it's boring. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you have Bonds in there, you have Bonilla in there, you have Will Clark, you have Jose Canseco.
Kevin
There's so
Mitchell.
many Kevin Mitchell. You have so many great players in 86 tops, but you're right. It's just kind of like a headshot. It's kind of boring. But you look at Barry Bonds, and I think history is probably not going to remember him real greatly because of all the PEDs and all. But him, Roger Clemens, those guys were Hall of Famers before PEDs.
Mm-hmm.
And they just took their numbers to a stratosphere. They were Hall of Famers before PEDs. It's kind of a shame. If you could separate the two, I think you'd probably let them in. Eventually, I think they will, because I think there are players that use PEDs that are in.
All right, well, take us home here. What's your number 5, Dan?
87 tops, future stars, Bo Jackson. I mean, the for all the potential and the talent you had going out in the beginning of the 80s, that supernova coming in at the end, Bo Jackson, and that was right in the heat of the hype. And just that card was just so amazing. We all wanted that card. I opened a vending box in 87 and pulled 2 of them and thought I was rich. I still am, because I have a bunch of them. They're not worth anything, but I just love them. And just to remember that time frame with Bo Jackson and what he meant to sports and baseball and football, and just the phenomenon is just amazing.
I almost included the same card in my stack, and I'm glad I didn't. And Bo was a superhero. Bo Jackson was a superhero. And that card, I like that it showed him fielding. Right?
Yep.
It looks like he's tracking a ball. It looks like a ball has been hit to center field. And who knows, maybe that was the play when he ran up on the wall. Remember that one where he ran on the wall. He's Spider-Man. He's Superman. He was everything. Dan, this has been incredible. I do want to ask one last question, and then I'll let you go.
Sure.
Is there any card from the 1980s that you don't have that you would like to add to your collection?
That's a tough question. I think I'd love to have an autographed copy of either the 84 Donruss Mattingly or an 87 Future Stars Bo Jackson. I think to get either one of those an autographed copy, a nice certified, would be probably the one thing, that I don't have that I would love to have.
That would be amazing. So as we let you go here, why don't you tell everyone again where people can find you on Instagram or wherever else?
Sure. I'm on Instagram at 1980s Cards with Dan. I'm on the web at www.1980scardswithdan.com. You get my blog on there. If you like what I think and you want to hear more of it, that's the place. If you don't, you're probably better off with Insta. I did move into TikTok a little bit. Again, 1980s Cards with Dan. And there may be a YouTube by the same name coming soon, but it's not really, there's no content there yet.
Dan, this has been great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
The Shallow End is a Wolfpack Network podcast. Thanks for listening.